It's September 22nd, 2016, and I'm in Washington, D.C., and Menno Ress is in Washington, D.C., and we're interviewing Leslie Chan, who is in University of Toronto at Scarborough, right?
Yeah.
And Leslie, do you want to start by just introducing yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a faculty member in the Center for Critical Development Studies, which is an international development studies specialist program here at University of Toronto, Scarborough. And I've been teaching here for quite a number of years now.
Leslie, we're going to ask you today to some questions about your role in the, we're going to ask you some questions about your role in the, I'm having a hard time see where we are right now. You can hear me okay, right? Oh, here we are.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask you a few questions about your role in the access to knowledge movement, in particular your activities as it relates to open access publishing. I'd like to start by, if you could explain to the audience out here how you would define open access publishing, and succinctly, because I listened to your TED Talk and read a lot of your interviews and things, but just succinctly, just to set things off, how would you describe to the audience what your concept of open access publishing or open access and platforms, and why you think they're important?
Okay, so first and foremost, if you don't mind me just make a correction in your use of the term open access, and you use it synonymously with open access publishing. And I would like to clarify that I think open access is a broad concept, and I will define it shortly, but then open access publishing is, I suppose, one strategy within the open access umbrella, if you will. So open access publishing is not the same as open access, which refer to free, unrestricted access to scholarly outputs, research outputs that are free of price and permission barriers. So publishing is one way, or one digital open access publishing in journals and other platform is one way to provide open access. But the other major way to provide open access is really traditional form of publishing and then providing a copy of that output, articles and whatnot, in open repository. So it is not publishing in the same sense. It's providing access.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'd like to begin. This is partly an interview about some of the history of these access movements, but also it's personal. Partly it's about you. I understand you grew up in Hong Kong. Is that correct?
That's right. I grew up in Hong Kong, and then I moved to Canada when I was 17 to come to school, and then I ended up staying for university, and have ended up making Canada my home ever since.
And do you feel like, but this, you're Canadian now, but your experience growing up in Hong Kong, it's really influenced the way you've looked at this issue in terms of your own work on access?
Yeah. So as I grew up. My parents left China as refugees in the mid 1940s, and they have to leave everything behind China and then start from scratch really when they arrived in Hong Kong, and they basically arrived with nothing as refugees. So when we were growing up, including all my siblings, 5 of us plus them, live in one room. There are no, a lot of basic necessity that you think about today. But as a kid growing up, you don't think about those kind of things. You just do, right? You just play and interact with your friends and neighbors, and I don't remember I had a fun childhood. And then as I was growing up, I see my dad doing well with his business and so forth, and was gradually moved in better housing, better schools and so forth. And Hong Kong has always epitomized for me this sort of entrepreneurial spirit of the people. People are always thinking of innovative ways to kind of take make use of resources and better their livelihood, particularly for their children. And it's a very vibrant society. And those who go to Hong Kong now look at it today would not have guessed what it was like in the 60s. We would have been considered a sort of epitome of a developing countries. But now you look at Hong Kong as a world finance center. So I've always looked at Hong Kong as kind of an interesting experiment about what education and what entrepreneurship and access to resources could do for the average person.
When did you start using the internet yourself, or computers before?
So when I was doing my PhD at University of Toronto in the late 80s, early 90s, that's when the internet was the thing amongst at least academics. I remember in the late 80s, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, introduced me to this thing called BitNet. And he said, oh, you can send messages to people all over the place as long as also they have a BitNet account. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. So I got my first email address in the late 80s, and still have it today. It's the same email address. And it was then I discovered things like Gopher and all these other means of uploading and sharing information on the internet. And I discovered all these online libraries. They were all text-based and command-based. But I found all this stuff for my PhD research that people would say, well, wow, where did you get all this stuff? And some of the stuff from parts of the world that even my library can get access to, even with their subscription. And it was actually, to a large extent, my frustration with the lack of access to research material from the developing world that I really went to the internet for alternatives, so that I was able to begin contacting colleagues from other parts of the world and ask them directly for research materials that I couldn't get through my library. Even though my library paid, even in those early days in the 90s, tons and tons of money to commercial licenses for those big packages that were becoming the norm at the time. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, you, like Peter Subert, you were studying philosophy. I mean, you weren't like studying computer science or.
No, I was studying physical anthropology.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My thesis was on the evolutionary history of the macaques. And macaques are these very far-ranging monkey species that you can find all over the world, in India, in Indonesia, in Africa, in the Middle East, and so forth. So there are scattered studies by local naturalists and researchers on these different species.
I apologize for misstating it. I'm actually interviewing John Womack later today, and he studied philosophy. So,
John is on.
I'm way out of myself. I apologize. But
it's okay. It's okay.
You were studying anthropology, also an area really outside of the realm of computer science and things like that. But you found this platform really, really important for your work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and actually, in part because of the field and because of the internet, I saw a lot of possibility early on, because, I mean, we're still taught to publish in paper, and I was in the field and I was starting to record behavior, with those primitive, video camcorder. They were gigantic back then, but we were able to capture videos, and the technology to digitize video was also starting to come on board. So I always thought, why couldn't we just digitize this video and publish this video as part of our paper, and then that way we don't have to argue about what we saw, because a lot of literature in my area was really misdescribing the same behavior, and so a lot of time was wasted. So I started writing about that early on.
When you say early on, when was that you started?
In the early 90s. So I talked about the potentials of using the internet to publish scientific research and using videos and other media to do so. Right?
Were you at the time? Were you sort of following the activities of Richard Stallman and the free software movement?
No, not at all. There was much later that I found out about all these open source philosophies and architecture. I mean, when I was using the early internet, I really didn't understand a lot of the technology behind it. But then as I needed to put stuff online and stuff, and there were not a lot of tools available, I had to start to learn about coding and about command lines, those kind of things. So I had to self-taught myself some of those things.
Did you, at what point did you start talking to other people about your ideas about more systematically expanding access?
Right. So as I was saying, that I became very interested in my own library because I always ask my librarian, how come, what are your decisions based on? How come, we have access to all these expensive journals, but I can't get access to a journal that costs $30 a year coming from India. And so I started asking a lot of questions about, these access issues. And I became so interested, I started organizing meetings and some conferences to learn more about it, to invite people and to talk about those kind of things. And so it was at one of the these meetings that I organized at University of Toronto. That was, I think, in 1997. Someone named Barbara Kirchhoff contacted me because she saw my call for participants on the internet. And she told me that, she's been working with colleagues in Brazil on this project called BioLine, which is to provide access to journals from the developing world to be placed on the internet. And so she wondered if we would be interested in hearing about it. So I invited Barbara to Toronto. And next thing you know, I became good friends and colleagues and collaborator. And I gradually actually took over the daily operation of BioLine, working with our colleagues that are based in Brazil, who provide the server, continue today, providing the server and the infrastructure for delivery of these journals, mostly from the developing world.
Could you elaborate on the BioLine thing? Because I found that one a really interesting part of your work in this area, that you saw this important area not only for having access to journal, but for people to be read around the world.
Right.
On the production of knowledge side. Yeah.
And again, also, we came up from a slightly different vantage point too. So as I said, I wasn't interested as much as about accessing the stuff from the global north. I was interested in accessing stuff from many parts of the world whose knowledge are not being discovered. And so to me, open access is a venue where a lot of neglected knowledge are being rediscovered, if you will, and connected. So this opportunity for connecting knowledge and having greater opportunity for colleagues from the global south to participate in the kind of knowledge production was what attracted me to open access.
You were one of the original people in the Budapest Open Access Initiative. How did you come to be invited to that meeting?
Yeah, again, it was through BioLine. So as you may know, the first meeting of the Budapest meeting was funded by Soros Open Society Institute, or now Open Society Foundation. And at the time, Melissa Hegeman, who should receive a lot of credit for her work in really formalizing and solidifying this open access movement, it was Melissa who organized this first workshop in Budapest in 2001. And she knew about our work, BioLine International, and so she contacted me to be a part of this group, to think about strategies to enable, and in fact, the title of that workshop when she first invited me was about creating a global knowledge commons, and that's what attracted me to the workshop.
What was the did you know a lot of the other people that you met at the meeting before, or was that the first time you met some of the people in that in that meeting?
Well, right. There were two other Canadians that were invited to that meeting. So Stephen Harnett, who by that time was well known because he's been really the first person, one of the first person to really systematically argue that the internet is a no-brainer as far as distribution of scholarly information. That open access it should be a default given the accessibility of the technology and so forth. And he was also instrumental in understanding the power of things like the physics archive at the time. So he was very much in favor of using open archiving as a means to providing free access to scholarly information. And so that was his continued to be his primary motivation. And so Stephen Harnett was at that meeting, and I knew Stephen before because I organized a meeting in Toronto where I invited Stephen and Jean-Claude Guidon, who was also at the Budapest meeting, to this other conference that I organized in Toronto to talk about scholarly communication. So I knew about them. I knew a few other people before through electronic channels, communicated with Peter electronically, but only met him there for the first time in 2001.
Can you talk a little bit about how things came down in that meeting, like how it went? I mean, just give us some sort of insider point of view of how that conversation went.
Well, again, the gist of it. So that at that time, so one of the person that was there was Michael Eisen, who later went on to found the Public Library of Science. And just prior to the Budapest meeting, Michael and his colleague had started this campaign, basically gathering signatures to boycott. If I remember correctly, I might need to check my own fact. To boycott Elsevier, so sort of online petition not to be doing peer review for them and so forth, because they are basically taking advantage of academics in terms of the free labors and so forth. And so he was invited there really to help brainstorm about what other strategies that we could do as sort of grassroots non-corporations. What can we do individually and collectively to promote this notion of free access to scholarship through different means? So the idea was to say, well, what possibilities could we think about differently? I was already doing BioLine at the time. It seems fairly easy for us to take traditional journals, convert it digitally, and put it on a platform for anybody to download. So the question is how to sustain it. How do we find the funding to continue doing that? And John Voltroff, who was with Biomed Central later, they're already thinking a lot about creating online open access journals. So, and of course, Biomed Central became very successful, and Springer bought Biomed Central later, and now Springer is one of the largest publishers or providers for open access options to scholarly publications. But these were things that I suppose we didn't know at the time, in terms of clause in terms of Springer Open and in terms of other kinds of initiative. We were there just to brainstorm and say, well, what broad strategies could people buy into, and would they buy into the notion of these sharing of knowledge that we put in our own labor for, and we should be able to reap the benefit of these labor through open technology. And we figured that is a fairly easy sale. So at least it's a principle, but what would be the mechanisms? What particular practical mechanism could there be put in place so that people can actually do it? So the idea of having these two strategies of open archiving was one, and then the other strategies of sort of born digital open access journals, so-called open access publishing, as you refer to, was the other strategy. So again, it was not meant to be sort of prescription. It was only meant to be aspirations and sort of ways for people to get started.
Well, how would you describe the nature of the declaration and its impact?
Well, I think soon after the Budapest Open Access Initiative was rolled out in 2002, and then a year after that.
Which is, it took a while from the meeting to the declaration. I mean, the declaration wasn't done in a day, right? It took a while.
No. So after the meeting, there were several months of intense online exchanges. I mean, intense. and Peter Schubert, again, has to take all the credit in terms of his masterful way of moderating a group of people, as you can imagine, with very, very strong opinions. And so the crafting of that document that you see online, the Budapest Open Access Initiative document, is really a very masterful synthesis of very, very diverse opinions synthesized into a set of consensus that we could all live with. So that took some time, as you can imagine. But after that was released, we soon saw there was the Bethesda Declaration, and then after that, there was the Berlin Declaration.
Yeah, they all had to start with B, right? Wasn't that the rule?
Sorry? They all have B's in it, right? Yeah. But we like to think that the Budapest kind of kickstart the other initiative as well.
And so you thought of yourself as sort of laying the early markers down on an aspirational basis about how the system should work from the point of view of authors and readers.
Sorry?
You saw that as laying down some early markers from an aspirational point of view of how the system should work for authors and readers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm just trying to see if I can summarize how you just described the impact of the declaration.
Well, again, my deeper interest in being a part of that declaration was, again, to underscore the fact that we have a knowledge system that is highly unequal. That the rich world have tremendous access, but not only tremendous access, but also tremendous opportunity to publish and to make their work available. And the flip side of that is that we have a lot of dedicated people doing research in other parts of the world whose research will not see the light of day, and yet a lot of their research have so much local relevance. If we want to understand disease condition in a local context or food security issue in a local context, we can't just rely on publication from the north described from afar. We have to be able to access locally relevant research. And unless we also support those locally relevant research, we're not going to have local researchers that continue to be able to provide those very much needed knowledge on which to build better understanding of the the problems on the ground. So that was really a key motivation for me. It's like, is to really do better science. If we want to do better science, we have to be able to include research from other researchers who are doing work on the ground, but the system just exclude them at the time, and I would say still continue to do so.
Do you still feel that there's a bit of a northern focus on the access and the open access movement, or do you feel like you've had a profound effect in getting people to look at it in a more global context?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, for the BioLine project, our partner actually are based in Brazil. If you look at the BioLine website, is based in Brazil, and Brazil actually is a country that's been a hotbed of open access since the early 90s, and many of people have heard about the Seattle project. So this is a nationally funded project to provide open access to journals that are published in Brazil. So the Brazilian government understood that providing access to research is fundamental as much as providing funding to do research in the first place. And the Seattle model spread to other parts of Latin America. So I think Latin America has been a leader in open access since the very beginning, and we have a tendency to forget that. And I think the global north have then took on the open access concept and often forget about how much has already been accomplished in other part of the world. And so we need to readjust that as well.
Has there been much back and forth between your work and the work of your colleagues on open access area and other vectors of access movement? For example, open educational resources, or open data, or free software movement, or the issues about access to medicine in terms of medical products. How do Creative Commons? I mean, how does your work? Do you have any reaction? Do you feel like you've been influenced by these other groups, or do you think they've been influenced by you? How do you sort of look at the larger picture and how things fit together?
Well, I mean, I'm glad to see that there are a lot more cross-fertilization today. But again, looking at the beginning, even sort of in the middle period of the open access movements, there was just not enough dialogue between people who are working in the open educational area and open source and then in open access. I'm glad to see that in recent years, we're seeing a lot more cross-fertilization, because ultimately there are a lot of shared goals in terms of enabling more access to education, to research, and they all go hand in hand. And in fact, I often use open educational resources as a leveraging point for promoting open access in my context in the university, because I mean, let's face it, we're paid to teach as well. Our job is not only to do research in the university, but to teach. And to teach well, you need to have access to good educational resources. Now, we can't just rely on textbooks, and textbooks often actually don't build very well on sort of cutting-edge research. So if we could integrate open access material directly into OER, open educational resources, I think it would be a huge benefit for our students who will go on to become better researchers and better teachers. And so to me, those are really logical links. And then in recent years, we're now seeing much more discussion in terms of open data. And so this whole broadest conversation about open science, I think is also quite helpful, because I think for me, the whole open science discussion I think allow us to expand beyond our obsession with the journals, because it's so much about open access. It's too got tied in with, as you say, open access publishing and the journal and the impact and the metrics and all that of the journal. I think this broader conversation about open science, which include open data, open access to research, and I would say including OER and everything, allow us to kind of broaden the discussion about what open means and what it can do for accelerating our understanding of research and learning.
So I mean, my background's in economics and to some extent in finance. So I'm always drawn to the issue of how you pay for things to be open. And are you satisfied with the research program on the business model for openness?
Well, I mean, the reality is providing open access is really the least expensive part of the whole system of production of knowledge and dissemination, right? I mean, our libraries are already paying huge amount for access. And I always argue that if the Rich Research Library were to set aside 1% of their budget for subscription, just 1%, we will have millions of dollars in the system to support open access initiatives.
Well, Leslie,
yeah.
Professor, would you be in favor of a mandate from the government for any library or institution which receives federal funding that they would set aside 1% for these open projects?
I would be in favor of it. I mean, I know I have tried to encourage library directors to think about that over the years, but of course, there's no incentive for them to do that, and it's hard for them to do that. But if there's a mandate, they can always blame it on the government. That we're made to do it.
Well, also, I mean, wouldn't it be the case that if everyone did it, everyone would be better off? But if only one person does it, then they think everyone else is a free rider, and they're the only person paying for it.
Well, I mean, as you know, this has always been the challenge, this sort of collective action problem, right? Who wants to be the first mover? And there's always a fear of this being, sticking the first person to stick out there. And if it doesn't work, then you kind of the laughing stock or whatnot. So it takes, I think, someone with courage to take the lead. But as you said, if this is a mandate and everybody do it, no one needs to stick their neck out, so to speak.
Well, I mean, if you look at copyright, that's not really a voluntary system, right? You don't sort of say, I'm going to voluntarily agree to honor copyright.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really have a choice, right? I mean,
right.
Copyright is really the law of the land. I mean, you have to respect the rights of copyright, or you can be guilty of infringement, or in some cases, criminal sanctions. So, I mean, it's an example for the publishing industry that they don't really rely on voluntary action by people to address their funding situation.
Mm-hmm.
But
the reality is there are lots of money in the system. It's about allocation, and it's about thinking differently about priorities, and that those kind of thinking. I mean, unfortunately, is taking much longer than I was hoping.
Yeah. Okay. There's a. What do you think of provisions in trade agreements or agreements between countries, like they have right now about intellectual property and other issues, where you'd internationalize the norms on access to government-funded research?
Yeah, those are interesting ideas. I mean, I've always thought about how about looking at free trade agreement in terms of these type of international publishing. Now, maybe you can tell me, but so a company right now, a multinational company, can go into any country and buy up a local publishing firm and then take over the journals, right? I don't think there are any national, a lot of regulatory mechanism in place for that. Now, if you are different kind of business, if you are in the oil business and you from the U.S. and you go into Nigeria to want to buy up an oil field, there are all kinds of regulatory things that regimes I imagine you have to go through, right? And yet, as far as these intellectual resources are concerned, it's very easy for a multinational to come into any place in the world and say, oh, we'll take over your journal, or we'll take over all your publishing. And now you're part of our intellectual property. And then anybody from anywhere in the world, including your own country, would have to pay us for access to this stuff. They're coming from your country, right? There doesn't seem to me, and I might be wrong, and you can tell me that, what are the trade regulations with regard to these kind of takeover of intellectual properties? And with free trade, I mean, any free trade agreement overseas is, and what about fair trade? You know, how could they come in and get this for nothing, and then all of a sudden they're selling this for thousands of dollars, whereas the publishers locally get nothing for it?
I've had Menno on this call, but I haven't really given her the microphone so far. And so, Menno, I'd just like to know if you would like to ask a question of Leslie at this point. I think she
just stepped up.
Oh, come on over here.
I've been listening and watching, but my computer froze and I didn't want to stop it, and then I would miss the discussion. So no, you covered a lot of ground, and I like the 1% idea. As you know, I always thought that was the right way to put it. There's a lot of money out there, a lot of knowledge. It's just a question of getting the political will. Now, I wanted to ask you, maybe it's a very naive question in terms of the Canada and the rest of the world. Do you think Canada and its own copyright reform or legislation is helping or not helping? How would you describe what's going on in Canada compared to the U.S.?
Well, I'm not sure if I want to. I mean, if we're talking about open access to scholarly information, seems to me copyright is almost peripheral to that. And what I'm seeing in Canada is that the major funding agencies, we call them the Tri-Council in Canada. There's a council that provide money for science and engineering. There's a council that provide money for social sciences and humanity. And there's a council that provide money for biomedical health research. And all those three major councils have a harmonized open access policy requiring all their funded research be made openly accessible within 12 months after the grant completed. So they either have to provide a copy on an institutional repository, or they have to publish in an open access journals. So in Canada, that policy by the major granting councils is very much in line with most of the major funding councils in Europe, mostly the EU countries.
That's interesting. It's the same push we're doing here and the one that's going on in Europe. Now, you said something else about earlier. I didn't want to interrupt you guys, but you said something about the obsession with journals. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, what are the other big issues that you think we in the openness movement should focus on?
Well, as I was saying to Jamie earlier, so this bigger conversation about open science is really opening the whole research process from the beginning till the end, if there's such a thing. It just seems to me it's just an ongoing cycle of building and building up. Right? So we tend to think of a publication as an endpoint of the research cycle, but the reality is that a lot of research are ongoing. And a lot of research produce all kinds of outputs, not all of which end up in a publication suitable for a journal. So there's a lot of data that are being created. There are a lot of notes that are being created. There are a lot of concepts, ideas that are being created along the way that may not have lived this full to the end. But though a lot of these sort of outputs along the way are deserving of recognition and also important to preserve because they allow future research in ways that might not have been anticipated. And so So we need to think more about all these different outputs in different forms, because they are all scholarly output, research output, and some of them are not being given credit. So sharing data and all those, sharing software, not just sharing articles, should be given credit in some way as well. So that's why I mean we need to move away from the journal article itself as being sort of the ultimate product of scientific process.
Yeah, we have a colleague in Canada who said that there's a discussion over the openness of even negative results because they're
exactly.
points. And I see what you mean, because that's what it's about. Let's have the open data even when it shows not success, not the great one. Now,
Right.
did Jamie talk to you at all about the other people that you think are really doing a great job or really worth looking at in terms of their focus right now in the movement or in the past? I think.
Well,
Yeah, did you touch on that?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to, I just wanted to just say that, that we're trying to map out some of the history of some of these access movements in different areas, like freedom of information, whistleblowers, patent disputes, things about open educational resources. And of course, we don't really know everything. And so we talk to people like you that do know a lot in this area. And one of the things we're saying is that who are the people that you look at that have really been leaders in this area that you think people should recognize the contributions they've made? And it's an unfair question, because you're going to immediately think when you stop of all the people you should have mentioned that you didn't mention. So
yeah, that's what I was afraid of. We're going to leave out a lot of people. But if I have to name, someone on the top of my list, it would be easy. It would be my colleague Arunachalam in India, right? So I can provide you, the full detail offline if you want. But Arun or Arunachalam is an information scientist, and for years been talking about this notion of the need for India to get on board with open access, well before open access became the term itself, because he recognized, again, the potential of all the science and knowledge that have been created in India, but again, the rest of the world don't know much about. And so for many, many years, Arun been working very tirelessly. So when the open access movement became more formalized, he had more of a platform with which to advocate for access to research across India. And he's been tireless doing that for the last 20 some odd years or so, traveling all across the country, going to institutions, giving talks, training young scientists, and so forth. So Arunachalam is on the top of my list, if you will.
Well, that's great.
That's
very helpful. Yeah,
because there's very few people, as Leslie mentioned, from the South that are really part of our world here in DC. But we meet them in conferences, but I think it would be important to have them on.
Yeah, so we should be giving their names to people at the World Intellectual Property Organization or UNESCO, or places that have academic conferences, things like that, to make sure that particularly in the UN environment, where it's supposed to be global in terms of the output. Are there things that we have not asked you about that you would like to say before we conclude the interview?
Well, I mean, if you could ask me, it's like, what would I really? I mean, what were some of the unanticipated consequences of open access? I would say one of the most unfortunate consequences of open access today is the overwhelming dominance of article processing charts as a mechanism for providing open access, particularly supported by many rich country funding organizations. I think it's a huge mistake. I think publisher is now laughing all the way to the bank twice over. Not only they get the subscription still, and now they're getting bundles of money from open access. because funding agencies haven't really properly contextualized when they provide funding to allow funding for open access publishing, so that they contextualizing their own output as a competitive advantage rather than as a global resource commons. So I think that particular ideology of somehow open access is a means to improve competition have allowed publishers to really co-opt the agenda of open access and allowing them to make even more money out of funding agencies, public funding agencies. So to me, that is a terrible consequence.
That's the scary part. Is there positive things that you see coming our way? No.
Yeah, so Mano's asking what do you think are some of the more the things that give you the sort of pleasant surprises, the sort of positive things you see on the horizon in the short term?
Well,
I know.
It's hard. I mean, it's like I was telling one of my students, I said, 10 years ago, I was far more optimistic than I am today. I'm still cautiously optimistic, but I'm just seeing so many unanticipated things that have grabbed hold of the agenda that have sort of derailed a lot of what we have thought. We thought open access is going to be an equalizing force and for more of a democratization of knowledge, but we're seeing actually things like APCs is increasing the gap between the rich and the poor in terms of who have now more means to provide open access quickly and more broadly. And so it's drowning out a lot of the other initiatives as a result of that.
Well, maybe sometime after we conclude the interview, we can come back to you and collaborate a bit on some of the if you have time for it, discussing some of the policy interventions that may provide better platforms and more sustainability of access.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I would be interested in exploring with you more is the linkage with access to medicine. Because again, one of my initial interests is really very much driven by access to health information, but there's a lot of close link between access to medicines and access to health information.
Well, that's great. We're going to have I think there should be
more cohesion,
more conversations between the open science people and the people working, for example, on delinkage between the prices of medicine and the way that you finance R&D. And that conversation is moving along. I mean, you see now, today the UN is endorsing this concept as it relates to microbial resistant drugs and new antibiotics. And there was a panel report on extending it to many more different types of diseases. And the U.S. Congress is considering, the national academies discussing it, public interest groups, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, Oxfam, a lot of different groups are working on this issue now. So I think things have moved along, and it would be, but also there's elements of this that I just had a request from Joseph Stiglitz this week, where he asked me, how do you quantify and measure the benefits of open source science? He was, I think, describing. And as you know, in your field, metrics becomes kind of like a huge issue for people, and it's a lot of unintended consequences there, right? So this idea of quantification and statistics and measure, sometimes people say if you don't measure something, it doesn't count, right? So if a woman doesn't get paid for her housework, somehow she's not part of the labor force, even though what she's done involves a lot of labor. Right. You'd have to pay a lot of money to do what she does, right? So I think that these are areas that are probably common, like the challenge of quantifying, assigning value to outside of market prices.
Yeah,
it's important to do at some point, but it's not easy, right?
Yeah, it was one of our research projects on open science in developing countries. that's precisely that's how we're gonna demonstrate impact. Right? And essentially, they like to have some indicators and metrics, and that's really the challenge. We want to resist easy measurement with numbers. Just count how many people benefited from certain things, but that doesn't really is not very meaningful in terms of real long-term impact. So, if Stigler could give us some advice on how to measure impact of open science, we certainly would like to know.
He's asking for advice.
We're working on which I will share with you, a simple model of how you compare the relative value of closed versus open science.
Mm.
But it's a very stylized model, and I'd be happy to share with you the way we've sort of gone about it.
Okay, sure. I'd love to have a discussion about that.
Well, we're gonna I think wind up here on this end, unless Menno, you want to ask
No,
additional questions.
I'm very grateful for your time. I think it's always very very interesting. A lot of thoughts now, and we'll get back to you. I'm pretty sure of that on those issues.
Yeah, we'll loop back on. We're going to be working, putting together some timelines of these access movements, and you will help us identify if we've left something out, or we might come back to you. But thank you very much.
Sure.
For this. It's a real pleasure. This is an area where I haven't been that active, and it's really been nice for me to be able to talk to you and Peter Suber and other people that work in this area, and so Heather Joseph and others. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for including me in the conversation.
Bye.
Okay, bye, Menno.
Bye, Leslie. You have to.